All right, Judges. We are studying the scriptures and discovering God's great plan for saving the world. We began all the way back in the book of Genesis, where we saw God made a perfect world and man broke it. And yet, in spite of the fact that man broke it, God had a plan to fix it. Obviously, that plan wasn't going to be based on man and his efforts, because in the first 11 chapters of the Bible, man proves that he is going to run away from God as quickly as he can. In chapter 12 of Genesis, we see that God's plan is actually going to center on a man and his descendants, Abraham and the nation of Israel. He makes some big promises to Abraham, and we see that one of those promises involves him giving them land. He was going to establish them in the land he promised, and he entered into a covenant with them. If they would obey this covenant, he would bless them beyond description, and they would be a picture to the world of the kingdom of God. And as we enter the book of Judges, honestly, we've come pretty far in the story, and we have a lot of hope. God has kept his promises, and he has done what seemed impossible. And he's taken this old man and given him descendant after descendant after descendant. Israel is a large nation. And he has given this nation the very land he promised them. He judged the Canaanites, kicked them out, and kept his word completely. God kept his promises completely. And Israel, at this point, looks actually like they are ready to keep their word to God as well. Joshua ends his book by charging the people to turn away from idols and to serve God. And the people respond by saying, "Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods, for it is the Lord our God who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and who did those great signs in our sight, and preserved us in all the way that we went, and among all the peoples through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God." Which sounds great. But Joshua isn't too sure, however, and he tells the people that he doesn't think that they will be able to be faithful to God. But even still, they respond, "No, but we will serve the Lord," which, if you know the history of Israel up to this point, is an amazing statement for them to make, because normally they're looking for every opportunity to forsake the Lord, but this generation is expressing their wholehearted commitment to God. Having seen the faithfulness of God, they're living in the land that he promised them, and one would think that Israel is set for a glorious future as we enter the book of Judges. Unfortunately, we see that things go wrong very quickly. Now, one way we see how wrong things went is simply by the name of the book itself, honestly. The book of Judges gets its name from the leaders that God used to rescue Israel from enemy hands during the period of time between Joshua and Samuel. These men weren't simply civil magistrates who sat in courts with long robes and decided on criminal cases. They were rescuers that God sent to deliver the nation. And already that tells you something is wrong. One scholar suggests that a good English word to describe what these judges were is the term warlord. Ideally, he writes, the warlord in foreign affairs is a deliverer. In eternal affairs, an administrator of justice. And in religious affairs, I am's covenant keeper. Judges 2:16 and 17 illustrates the meaning of this term. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, but whored after other gods and bowed down to them. The judge was the man God chose to rescue Israel from the enemy because they had been punished because of their idolatrous ways. Though each of these men was used to lead Israel, Judges 11:27 reveals the ultimate judge or deliverer. Judges 11 verse 27 says, I therefore have not sinned against you, and you do me wrong by making war on me. Now here's the part that's important. The Lord, the judge, decide this day between the people of Israel and the people of Ammon. The Lord is the judge, the rescuer of Israel, and he uses human men to rescue them. And we'll meet 12 of these men throughout the book of Judges, and one who doesn't call himself a judge, but actually describes himself as a king. These judges don't rule over Israel all at one time. Some of the judges overlap. Some of their names are familiar. Some of them are not. Some of the judges get a great deal of attention. Others are more minor characters, and there's much less information given about them. But the fact that Israel needed judges at all who would be deliverers tells you that something went very wrong. I mean, delivered from what? They wouldn't have needed to be delivered if they had just kept the covenant. And that should create in us a curiosity as we approach this book. What exactly did go wrong with Israel? We don't know who the human author of Judges was for sure, but we do know certain things about when he wrote the book. If you look at Judges chapter 17, verse 6, he describes the state of Israel in those days. He says, in those days there was no king in Israel. So this book was written about a time in which there was no king, but because he says in those days there was no king, we assume the author must be writing when there was a king. Judges 1:21 tells us something about who was living in Jerusalem at the time of the book was written. Judges 1:21 says, but the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Now that's an important little insight, because in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 6 through 10, we see that David actually drove out the Jebusites from Jerusalem. So David got rid of all the Jebusites. If you look at Judges 1:29, you can see who occupied Gezer. Ephraim did not drive the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, so the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. But 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 16 and 17 tells us something about this place, Gezer, that's important to understand. It says, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and captured Gezer and burned it with fire and killed the Canaanites who lived in the city. And that's at the time of Solomon. So Judges seems to have been written after the monarchy had been established. In those days there was no king in Israel, but before David, because David was the one who drove the Jebusites out, and certainly before Solomon, because Pharaoh had killed all those living in Gezer that were Canaanites at that time. So this is why many have attributed the authorship of the book of Judges to Samuel, the kingmaker. It would make sense. We'll see that Samuel's primary role in salvation history was to appoint the king, and so it's no surprise that he writes the book of Judges, which demonstrates Israel's need for a king. As we approach the book of Judges, we want to keep in mind what God has said he's intending to do through Israel. Like always, before we look at the details, we want to make sure we connect it to the big picture. What has Israel received from God in the book of Joshua? The land. And that gift is huge. But that gift is not the end of God's plan for what he has said he'll do through Israel. As we said many times, Israel was blessed to be a blessing. Stephen Wellum explains, Israel's role in the world was not only to be the nation by which the Messiah would come and reverse the effects of sin and death. They were also called to live as Adam and the entire human race was supposed to live, as obedient sons and servant kings in relationship to the Lord and the entire creation. Israel was to fulfill the role of Adam by living as a kingdom of priests, to serve as God's son and representative, and thus display to this poor, fallen world what it means to be truly human. In other words, Israel was to be different from the nations around them for the good of those nations. God had just ejected the Canaanites from the land and replaced them with Israel, who was supposed to be holy. But what we'll see is that Judges tells the story of how Israel kept getting worse and worse and worse until by the end of Judges, they are worse than even the Canaanites were. So clearly, Judges is indicating that something in Israel is lacking. There is something Israel needs if it's going to fulfill the purpose that God has for them. But what is that need? Perhaps by looking at the very first verse and the very last verse, we get a hint. Judges 1:1. After the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? What's happened in Judges 1:1 is Joshua has died. This great, great leader, Joshua has died. Now, fast forward, Judges chapter 21, verse 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So what do you think that the writer of Judges is trying to show us about what Israel needs? They had a great leader. He died. By the end of Judges, there is no leader. There is no king. Now, there are several texts from the Pentateuch that we must remember if we're going to understand what happens to Israel in the book of Judges. What is Israel supposed to do according to the following passages? Listen to Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 through 4. When we read this passage, we see that God is bringing Israel into the promised land, and they are to clear out the nations that are living in the promised land at that point. They are not to show mercy to them. They are to really destroy them, and whatever they do, they can't intermarry with them. Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 4. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 through 18 tells us what they were supposed to do as well. But in the cities of these people that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction. Now, why were they supposed to do this? Why were they supposed to go in there and destroy the Canaanites? Well, Genesis 15:16 tells us that God had given those nations time to repent and change, but they hadn't. They were continuing on in sin. Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 5 also tells us that Israel was to defeat these nations because of the wickedness of these nations. Listen to the way he puts it. Do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust these nations out before you, it's because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. Whereas it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you. Not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart are you going in to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God is driving them out from before you, and that he may confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So God is keeping his promise, but he's actually judging these nations for their wickedness. And why is it so important that Israel obey God in this? Numbers 33, 55, and 56 tells us one reason why. If you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then those of them whom you let remain shall be as barbs in your eyes and thorns in your side, and they shall trouble you in the land where you dwell. God's saying you need to drive these nations out, one, as an act of judgment, but two, if you don't, what's going to happen is they are going to do damage to you. Deuteronomy 8, 19, and 20 tells us a little bit more about how they'll do damage. If you forget the Lord your God and go after other gods and serve them and worship them, I solemnly warn you today that you shall perish. Like the nations that the Lord makes to perish before you, so you shall perish, because you would not obey the voice of the Lord your God. If Israel didn't obey God, they would become like the nations, and if they become like the nations, God's going to judge them the way that he judged the nations. So what would happen to Israel if they did not do what God said for them to do? Deuteronomy 28, verse 15 summarizes what we've been saying so far. Moses says, if you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all his commandments and his statutes that I command you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. And Moses begins to just relay all of the different judgments that God would bring upon Israel. We enter the book of Judges then with a lot of hope, but some serious concern. God has given Israel a purpose, and he's instructed them in the first steps of how they are to fulfill that purpose. If they don't obey God here, there is going to be some serious damage to them, and really, if they are judged, that makes us question, how is God going to keep his promise to defeat Satan? So Judges is a book that we should be reading with anticipation. What is going to happen to Israel? Now, before diving into the specifics of the book, it helps us to get a broad overview of where this book is taking us. And so a very bare bones way of explaining the structure of the book would be as follows. Chapter 1 through chapter 3, Israel's great fall anticipated. Chapter 3, verse 7 through chapter 16, verse 31, Israel's great fall illustrated. And then chapter 17, verse 1 through chapter 21, verse 25, Israel's great fall completed. Now, Judges is a very well-crafted book. And if you look at the book a little more carefully, you can see it falls into 3 sections. There is a prologue, and even that prologue is what you might call a double prologue. You have the conditions for apostasy described in chapter 1, verse 1 through 2:5. You have the course of apostasy described in chapters 2:6 through 3:6. Then there's a double presentation. You have from chapter 3:7 through chapter 5, the first 3 main judges. And then from chapter 6 to 16, you have the last 3 main judges. And then finally, there's a double conclusion. So there is a prologue, there is a presentation, and there is a conclusion, and they're all doubles. The conclusion is chapter 17 through 18, that's the first part. Chapter 19 through 21, that's the second part. And it's as if in the conclusion, the writer wants us to see how terrible everything has become. And so he just shows us a religious mess and a moral mess that has occurred in the nation of Israel. So Judges illustrates what happens when God's people forget God and turn their back on the covenant they made with him. And there are 2 key words that help you understand how Judges tells its story. The first word is cycle. The second word is descent. A cycle is a pattern of things that happens over and over, and a descent is obviously a fall. And so at first, it looks like Judges is describing a cycle of sin, repentance, deliverance, and then repeated sin. But when you examine the book a little more closely, you see that cycle is really a descent further and further down into greater and greater sin. As Paul House explains, this book describes what occurs when a covenant people forsake that covenant and do whatever each individual sees fit rather than follow the revealed word of the Creator of all lands and people. Specifically in Judges, no issue matters more than Israel's commitment to covenantal monotheism. Any deviation from this principle results in disaster for the nation. Every time the author states that Israel displeases God, it is idolatry that causes the problem. Other sorts of sins can be forgiven as individuals turn to God who forgives, but those who worship idols cut themselves off from theological reality and a relationship with a living God, and only judgment can result. There are 2 groups of passages that help us understand really the purpose of the book. First of all, Judges 2:11, 3:7, 4:1. Listen to what the writer says in these passages. Judges 2:11. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. Judges 3:7. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals. Judges 4:1. The people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. Judges 6:1. I think you're going to guess what it says. The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And over again, continually through the book of Judges. Then Judges 17:6. That's the first set of passages that talk about Israel continually doing evil and being judged. Second set of passages, Judges 17:6. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Judges 21:25. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And if we look at those two sets of statements, we see one, Judges was written to show the spiritual condition in Israel during the period between Joshua and the monarchy, and also to demonstrate that one of the solutions to that problem was that of a holy king. Bruce Waltke explains, the book of Judges makes the argument that to be an effective tool in the hands of I Am, Israel needs a covenant-keeping king to shepherd them, not spiritually crippled, charismatic warlords. As we study the book of Judges, we are going to see one step great forward in God's great salvation plan. Israel seems to be doing everything they can, actually, to ruin God's plan. He has done so much to put them in the land, and they turn their backs on God. And yet, even as they turn their backs on God, God is pulling back the curtain just a little bit more to show us what Israel needs, and really what we need is for God to send the perfect king, which we'll look at, and we'll see how this story develops more in the videos that follow.